Hello class, welcome back to Psychome with me, Dr. M. Ackerman. Today's lesson is a two-parter that's going to cover a lot of ground, so strap in. We're jumping around a bunch of different areas of psychology, from clinical to cognitive to community to social. Because of that, it's going to be really important that you've done the reading. We're talking all 13 episodes of OddTaxi from start to finish. I know I can tell y'all to do the reading all that I want to, but I know some of you are going to skip it, so here's what we're looking at. OddTaxi is a show about a taxi driver who gets caught up in a missing persons case. The case ends up dragging in the Yakuza, an idol group, a back alley doctor and his nurse, and a whole bunch of other people. Psychology is woven throughout the series, mostly as a plot device, so let's start with some disclaimers. We've got some definite mental illness rolling around in this anime, and most of the characters who have these mental illnesses are portrayed as violent. I want to make it clear that this isn't a reflection of reality. Mentally ill people are way more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of it. I'm also going to be pointing out a fair number of flaws in the way this show portrays psychology. That's okay, this doesn't mean it's a bad show. It's just taking creative liberties, and that is okay. Just don't write a psychology paper based on what you learned from it. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about with this show, so I'm gonna do something new. I'm breaking this video up into two parts. The first part will cover just Odokawa and what Goriki and Shidokawa think about him. The second part will cover a lot of other characters, basically everyone else. So look forward to it. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go. Odokawa, our wonderful stoic protagonist with a secret. See, when Odokawa was just a kid, he got in a car accident, and he ended up with some kind of brain damage or something a lot like it. Now, spoilers, he sees people as animals. Of course, we don't find out that he has something wrong with his brain until pretty late in the series, and we don't figure out exactly what's going on with him until the last episode. That doesn't mean it's not foreshadowed, though. The first thing we know is that he's got something going on with his brain. It's not super clear if it's completely trauma or if it's part physical injury, and I don't know if we'll ever get an answer. There aren't a lot of clues. Sure, a car accident and oxygen deprivation from being stuck underwater can cause brain injury, but it's not always gonna. I'd say that the biggest evidence that he's got something wrong with his brain is the fact that he's got an MRI in his medical file. MRI are good for diagnosing brain injuries, including the kind that Odokawa would have gotten, but that doesn't necessarily mean much. It makes sense they'd want to check for physical trauma after an accident, and a lot of the symptoms Odokawa shows can be explained by trauma or by physical brain damage. Brain damage can cause sleep disturbances that he mentions, but so can mental trauma. Memory loss of the incident where his parents died, that could be brain damage or it could be trauma. Let's zero in on memory loss since that's a big plot point. It's not so secret that head trauma can lead to memory loss, and it's a plot point used by a lot of stories to the point where it has a TV tropes page. This is typically referred to as laser-guided amnesia, because these people only forget one very specific thing, but that's not really how this works in real life. If you forget one thing, you're probably going to forget a lot of other things as well. The closest you'll get to laser-guided amnesia is people who suffer memory loss due to brain injury. They'll often forget the incident that caused the brain injury, like Odokawa did. But Odokawa probably didn't suffer a bump on his head. It's more likely that his physical brain damage was caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain when he was underwater, aka cerebral hypoxia. Cerebral hypoxia can absolutely lead to memory loss, along with a whole host of other symptoms. Odokawa doesn't experience all these symptoms, though. In fact, out of the list of long-term effects of cerebral hypoxia, pretty much the only things Odokawa shows are memory loss and maybe hallucinations? I'll get into why I think the hallucinations aren't a result of physical brain damage later in the lecture. I also don't think his memory loss from physical trauma fits either. If it was, he probably wouldn't have been able to recover his memories of his accident without somebody else describing the accident to him. So where does this leave us? Well, trauma, but the mental kind. Traumatic events can lead to memory loss. I mean, to start, mental trauma can absolutely leave a physical mark on the brain. This is particularly true for kids, like Odokawa was during the incident. Experiencing trauma can affect physical neurological development, and a whole bunch of other things, including memory. There's a couple of conditions that can explain memory loss after trauma. The first is dissociative amnesia. That's a loss of memory often after a traumatic event. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual version 5, or the DSM-5, describes dissociative amnesia as being unable to recall autobiographical memory associated with a traumatic event, which definitely is a thing that we see with Odokawa. But we don't really see some of these others so much. He doesn't remember the accident, but he doesn't seem at all distressed that he can't remember, and there is a possible physiological cause with brain damage. The other two do fit, but I think it's really mainly the lack of distress that makes me think that this doesn't quite work. Odokawa's a pretty chill guy. He's pretty even keel. Then we have post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This also can lead to some memory weirdness, but again, Odokawa's chill nature, it doesn't really fit here. It is possible that Odokawa's memory loss is some kind of psychological condition that isn't listed in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. The DSM isn't the be-all end-all of clinical psychology, and it can't possibly describe every single variation of normal and abnormal functioning. Usually it's taking symptoms that tend to pop up together and putting them in categories as sort of general guides for how to treat a generic patient than it is describing objective discrete categories. That's why they update it every few years. It's also possible that his inability to sleep is leading to memory loss, but outside of the accident, his memory is pretty impeccable, so that probably isn't it either. Still, the way OddTaxi portrays Odokawa's memory loss doesn't really fit any known physical or psychological conditions associated with memory loss that I can find. It does get the treatment right, though, or at least part of it. Memory notebooks like Odokawa's are used for people with memory loss due to dementia, head trauma, or what have you. They're pretty effective in helping memory, but not necessarily in the long term. I probably can't attribute Odokawa's great memory to his notebook after 30-odd years of not using it. So, Odokawa's memory loss is weird. It doesn't really fit into any neat scientific categories, but that's okay. That's okay. There's plenty of other opportunities for accuracy in this show, so let's talk about something else that's definitely psychology related. Oh. Oh. Oh no. Look. Goriki tried. He tried. The writers tried, but this is really more rule of cool than science. I know I talked about how weird human brains can be during my It Invaded video, but this is a bit out there even for the human brain. Again, I liked this show. I like this show a lot. Being inaccurate doesn't make something bad. Sci-fi is a genre that wouldn't exist without some suspension of disbelief, and I sure as hell love it when cars randomly explode in movies when they never would in real life. Okay? We good? Good. Okay. Spoilers. OddTaxi takes place in our world, or one that's really, really similar to it. Everyone's human, but Odokawa sees everyone as animals. Something assigned gorilla at taxi. Odokawa thinks that he's a walrus, Shirokawa is an alpaca, and the Daimon brothers are dogs. Because he sees people as a wide variety of animals, he's really good at recognizing people, even in dark and blurry pictures or from behind. Even if he's only seen them once. And this is the major plot point. Over the course of the series, Goriki gives us two possible explanations for Odokawa's ability to do this. In episode 8, he thinks it's synesthesia, and in episode 13, he says it's visual agnosia caused by executive dysfunction. So, synesthesia, let's start there. Synesthesia is one of the more well-known psychological conditions because it's so darn interesting. It's pretty much what Goriki described. Your senses get crossed. How it works differs from person to person. Some people can taste colors or see sounds. It does seem like it's got some kind of genetic component to it as well, because it can run in families, and it's not a hallucination. It's some kind of weird neurological mix up, and there's no evidence of it being connected to traumatic brain injury or trauma. So, you're probably starting to see a problem with Gariki's diagnosis. Odokawa only started seeing people as animals after his accident. That's a pretty sudden onset, especially for something that has a genetic component to it. Not saying that genetic things can't be triggered by things that you experience in life, but in this case, I don't really think that's the case. Worse than that, he's not mixing up his senses. Odokawa's sight is still his sight. Hearing, taste, touch, and smell all seem to be completely separate here. If there are other senses involved, it doesn't make sense that he could recognize someone from a photograph when all he can use is his sight to perceive that photograph. He's just seeing things differently for most people. That's not synesthesia or anything like it. But hey, Gariki's not a neurologist. So what did the presumably a neurologist alligator say? Whoa. Let's break that down. I'm gonna set aside the visual agnosia part for now because that's the most important bit here. Why do I think executive dysfunction isn't as important? Well, because executive dysfunction is a really broad term. Executive dysfunction is just the brain having trouble with all kinds of executive processes, like the ability to pay attention, make plans, restrain yourself, hold things in your memory, think flexibly, and so on. Executive dysfunction pops up in the vast majority of unhealthy things that brains do. Kind of oversimplifying, but saying that a symptom of mental illness or visual agnosia was caused by executive dysfunction is like saying the bruise on your leg was caused by an injury. Those are the same thing? A bruise is a specific type of injury. They're the same kind of thing. Except visual agnosia isn't even a type of executive dysfunction. Executive dysfunction and visual agnosia are two separate possible outcomes of brain damage. It doesn't make much sense to say visual agnosia was caused by executive dysfunction. And, see, visual agnosia caused by head trauma, that makes a lot more sense, and that's probably more likely what's going on here, if anything. And it's gotta be head trauma. See, visual agnosia isn't a result of traumatic events, it's the result of traumatic injury. Which makes it all the more baffling that Odokawa is suddenly magically cured after he drives his car into the river in episode 13. The treatment for traumatic brain injury is not more traumatic brain injury. Anyway, does visual agnosia even cover what's happening with Odokawa in his zoo vision? I think it's pretty obvious by now that my answer is going to be no. There's a pretty cool reason for this, though. Let's start with what visual agnosia is. It's basically when you have trouble recognizing the stuff you're seeing. You might see a car. Your visual cortex is processing that car just fine. But when your brain goes to say, okay, what's this object I'm seeing? It draws a blank. These people can see perfectly fine. They can also touch, smell, and hear things and know exactly what those things are. It's just that when they see things, they can't make the connection. Dr. Dominique Malowski, a neuroscientist from Singapore, thinks that this viral image from a few years back might be what it's like to have visual agnosia. You can see a lot of distinct shapes, but you've got no idea what the heck any of them are. Now, that's not the be-all end-all. Like pretty much any mental or neurological disorder, everybody experiences agnosia a little bit differently. There are a bunch of different types of visual agnosia. I'll start running through the ones Odokawa definitely doesn't have, and then get to the one that I think is closest to what the writers did, and why that one doesn't make sense. There's simultanagnosia. This is when you can't recognize objects when they're in a group, and you've got trouble processing what a group of objects might mean. It's kind of like neurologically being incapable of seeing the forest for the trees. You could recognize a tree if it was on its own, but if you saw a whole bunch of trees together, you'd have trouble telling what they were. Then there's color agnosia. You can't tell apart colors. You're not colorblind. You can see colors perfectly fine, but you just can't tell them apart. Your brain, there's a disconnect there. Then there's topographical agnosia. You can't use visual cues to navigate. You get lost a lot if you've got this, probably. Then finger agnosia. You know your fingers are fingers, of course you do, but you can't tell which finger is which. You couldn't tell your thumb from your pinky. Then there's a kinetopsia, where you can't see motion, the whole world is basically a slideshow. And agnostic alexia, you can't recognize words if they're written down. You can speak and write just fine, but you can't recognize written words on a page or screen. And now for the one that I think that is closest to Odokawa. Prosopagnosia. This is also known as face blindness. You can't recognize faces. You can recognize individual bits of individuals, like their gender, what they're wearing, what their hair looks like, but their faces? Nope. If Odokawa had this, he'd have way more trouble recognizing people than the average person, not less trouble. See, agnosia makes you unable to recognize things. It doesn't make you see one thing when you're looking at another. Maybe you might confuse a person for a hat, like in Oliver Sacks' famous case study of Dr. P, but that's because you can't recognize either a person or a hat when you saw it, not because you see a hat when you look at a person. Even if it did work that way, the fact that Odokawa sees people's faces and bodies as animals doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a type of agnosia specifically for faces because we have a subsystem in our brains specifically built for processing faces. It's part of why we see faces in random stuff like the moon or the clouds or in a grilled cheese. But Odokawa's perception isn't just skewed for faces. He still thinks Shirakawa's an alpaca from behind when he can't see her face at all. The heck? That doesn't make any sense. Look, agnosia's caused by actual brain injury. There's no cure for it. Even if there was, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be. Say it with me. More head trauma. I don't care how hard Odokawa fell into that river or how much mental and emotional growth he experienced over the course of the series. If visual agnosia was the issue, he's never seeing another human being as a human being ever again. Ugh. Anyway. Odokawa's injury is an amazing narrative device. It makes the series so much more fun and unique. I really enjoyed it. But don't be under any illusions that anyone talked to any actual psychologist while writing his character. If they did, they ignored those psychologists. At most, they found a few big words that seemed like they might be tangentially related to what they wanted to do and slapped them into a script. Luckily, there is a heck of a lot more accuracy in how it portrays other characters and their storylines. We'll get to that in part 2. For now, we're all out of class time. We will continue this next time. See ya!